I've always had a problem with my name. For the first months of life, I lived without one while my parents tried out names a week at a time to see if they fit. My mother's favorite was Leopoldina, after the Crown Prince Leopold of Austria, where she'd been born. I'd be Poldy for short. Mercifully, my father put his foot down, stamping out the future cruelty that such a culturally ill-fitted name would engender. Suffering through years of teasing as the class fat girl, I silently thanked him. Poldy would have been the icing on the cake. Maria Theresa was another contender, but they eventually decided the royalty connection might in itself be a burden. They both liked Teresa, though, and Julia as well. But then there was the question of the order. Teresa, without the H, was the winner, what they wanted to actually call me. But to them, Teresa Julia didn't sound as good as Julia Teresa. So Julia Teresa Agee it was, and I would simply go by my middle name. I don't know why they spelled it without the H, though I remember asking my mother about that, because I had to make a point of it all the time, since people usually put the H in when they heard the name Teresa. I don't remember her answer, but I came to feel there was something decidedly lower class about spelling Teresa with an H. During the name tryouts, my grandmother called me Chickadee and never gave it up. As a toddler, imitating her, trying to name myself, I said Deedee, and it stuck. Other Deedees I've met are really Deirdres, Denises, or Deborahs, and people always ask if I'm one of those. It used to embarrass me to tell how, beginning as Julia Teresa, I ended up Deedee, like a Just So story. Anyway, through grade school, I had two names, Deedee at home, Teresa in school, and the world at large. This seemed right, since I experienced myself as two different people. Deedee was a sad, bored, overly sensitive, temper tantrum-throwing child who caused problems for the adults. Teresa was a shy, cooperative, responsible good girl who all the teachers loved. The at-home tantrum thrower seemed more like my real self to me, so Deedee felt like my real name. Teresa, an alias, a cover name for the fake good girl I was in the outside world. My mother kept getting it wrong, referring to me as Deedee outside the family context. I held on to this ideal girl, Teresa, made so concretely real by the metal dog tags given to us in school in first grade, with my official name, address, parents' names, and phone numbers stamped into the metal. I wore them always, even in bed, on a long chain around my neck, safe in the knowledge that should I die in a war, I'd be identified. The tags matched to my name, typed and stored safely in a file somewhere in Washington, D.C. The second year after my father died, in fifth grade in my new school, St. Luke's, I met Karen, who was new too. Her parents were divorced. Her father lived in Chicago. We felt a mystical connection from the start. We each had a picture of our father in which they wore identical plaid shirts, and took this as a sign that it was our destiny to meet, that we were somehow made for each other. Karen called me by both names, depending on context, and always got it right. She brought the two sides of me together, accepted them both, giving me a more solid, lasting identity. In sixth grade, my father's book, A Death in the Family, was awarded the Pulitzer Prize posthumously. Now my surname, Agee, became a bigger problem than the many mispronunciations I'd grown used to correcting. Agee, Agee, Agee. When people heard my name, they said, "Oh, are you related to the writer?" And when I said yes, they'd fall all over themselves about how wonderful my father was, and they couldn't believe they were actually in the presence of his daughter, and how proud I must be, and what was it like having a famous father, and do I remember him, and what do I remember, until I wished I had a different last name, almost as much as I wished I had my father alive and well in my life. It was akin to being named after royalty, as though lineage had more to do with who I was than my own presence in time and space. The first year of high school at Music and Art, I took a small step toward unifying my world. I told new kids my name was Deedee, though teachers, going by the official forms, still called me Teresa. Julia had fallen by the wayside years before. In my infatuation with all things French, I changed the spelling from D-E-E-D-E-E to D-I-D-I. Besides, the overabundance of E's in Deedee Agee was ridiculous. When I said my name, people thought I was saying letters like IBM or something. I considered putting the H back in Teresa and exchanging the final A for an E to become Therese, but realized those accent marks would present new problems, especially when typing. Anyway, that seemed just too phony. Even the change to D-I made me feel like an imposter, too sophisticated and worldly wise for the real me. At 15, away at boarding school, I was Deedee with ease to teachers and students alike. For the first time, I had one name everywhere I went. Living away from home, I discovered a new unified sense of self. I no longer needed a separate in-the-family name. That Christmas, to my great disappointment, my mother and grandmother took me and my siblings to Austria for the holidays to visit Aunt Lily. I wanted to stay in New York to see my old friends and go to holiday parties with the new ones. In any case, I had to get a passport. The passport, based as it was on my birth certificate, said I was Julia Teresa. A small thing, seemingly, but along with missing out on my real life back home and my mother and grandmother constantly forgetting what language they were speaking in, disconcertingly blathering on to me and my brother and sister in German, and insulting hotel personnel by accident because they thought they were speaking English while they complained about the lousy service, not to mention meeting relatives, my own flesh and blood, who claimed still that the Holocaust was a lie, American propaganda, they said. Somehow, the new solid identity I thought I'd forged at boarding school dissolved, as ephemeral as a disturbed reflection rippling across a pond. Unsure of who I was, I convinced myself I was pregnant and ended up kicked out of boarding school after one semester, living in New York with my Aunt Lois instead of at home, to protect my siblings from the bad influence that was me. My mother maintained a stony silence, communicating with me even in my presence only through my aunt, but that's another story. On college application forms, I filled in Julia Teresa Agee. It seemed fitting as I embarked on my adult life to be known by the name on my Social Security card. I felt it bestowed a certain legal standing, a legitimization of sorts, like the dog tag. Referring to their forms, teachers called me Julia, and I decided to try it out. Perhaps my official identity would somehow be an aid to finding out who I was. But I discovered I had to rope off a piece of my mind like a fallow pasture for the sole purpose of realizing that when I heard the word Julia, it might mean me. This was quite taxing. Julia seemed so not me, so a part of a distant 19th century European world of privilege and repression, that I soon told everyone to just call me Deedee, and dropped the Agee whenever possible. I liked the idea of being a one-named entity like Sappho or Cher. Midway through college, drowning in my continuing identity crisis, I dropped out, moved in with Bill, my much older boyfriend, decided to have a baby and got married, changing my name to Bollinger. We moved to a 200-year-old unheated farmhouse in upstate New York, and I got a driver's license and checking account in the name Julia Bollinger. It was a relief to be free of the burden of being the public daughter of. I also discovered an enticing new identity. I was now a secret Agee. Perhaps, having lived with a context-sensitive dual identity most of my life, I simply felt at home. Perhaps being a secret Agee strengthened my identity as a writer, protecting it, just as being the daughter of had been a threat. Shortly after my first son was born, my mother, idly perusing his birth certificate, saw Julia Teresa in the box marked mother's name and said, "Why, that's wrong." She said that my official name was Teresa Julia with an H in the Teresa. I felt shell-shocked. "But don't you remember all those stories," I said, "about the order that sounded better and dropping the H and all?" No, she was adamant. Teresa Julia was my name. Desperate, I unearthed my own birth certificate, showed her triumphant right there in ink on parchment, bearing the raised seal of the state of New York, the name Julia Teresa Agee without the H. She peered at the worn paper through her half glasses and a cloud of smoke and said simply, offhandedly, "Huh, interesting. They made a mistake." I have been married 5 times, twice to the same person, once solely to get health insurance when I needed a minor operation I couldn't afford. I've gone by the last names Agee, Bollinger, Grossman, Moranti, and Sprecher, and the first names Julia, Teresa, and Deedee. The possibilities for varying combinations of these names still plague me. My driver's license says Agee, my passport Sprecher. I have credit cards in 2 or 3 names: Julia Teresa Agee, Deedee Sprecher, Julia Agee Sprecher. When I use a credit card, I have to read it first to find out who I am. When I occasionally get royalty checks from my father's work, the check is made out to Teresa J. Agee, a tribute to my mother's memory reversals. I always have trouble cashing it. The upside is when people call about my defaulted student loan and ask for Julia as though they're a long-lost friend, they've tipped their hand. I say, she's not home. Tell them I'm just the cleaning lady and don't know when she'll be back. When I began to teach writing in colleges, I decided to use the name Agee again, grateful finally for whatever advantage my father's notoriety might provide. The name no longer elicits the same starstruck reaction, and I no longer mind so much when it does. I've come to know that most people live with multiple identities, secret personas they shelter and nourish until the time and place are right. Secrets have a life of their own. Like the ghosts of absent people, they are a presence in our lives. So when, before signing things, I need to ask, who am I here now? I see it as a good thing, a kind of safety net for dreams. Water out. Thank you.